At the Group of 20 held on the 22nd and 23rd of November 2025, before 22 leaders of the world's leading powers, a shocking moment occurred. The president of Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré, stepped onto the stage and completely broke traditional diplomatic norms. In a declaration that left the entire hall stunned, he forcefully condemned, "The African Union no longer exists. It survives only on paper." That statement struck like a direct blow to Africa's largest institution, something no leader had dared to say for many decades, especially at the very center of the Group of 20. What drove a young leader to challenge an organization representing more than 1 billion people? Why choose this moment? And why do millions of Africans see him as their voice? To understand the true reasons behind this shocking speech, hit like and join us as we explore the story. When the Group of 20 convened for its annual summit, Burkina Faso's presence was seen as little more than a diplomatic courtesy. A small, landlocked nation, better known for instability than influence, was granted observer status. A symbolic gesture many assumed would pass quietly, but the world misjudged both the moment and the man representing it, President Ibrahim Traoré. Global leaders anticipated the familiar script. They expected mentions of Sahel terrorism, appeals for international support, and discourse about regional development. After all, this is what African heads of state typically bring to the global stage. But Traoré, representing a Burkina Faso that had already broken from old patterns, delivered something radically different. Standing before presidents, prime ministers, and economic giants, he laid out a blunt indictment. Africa's largest political institution, the African Union, no longer represents the continent it claims to serve. He reminded the Group of 20 that the African Union had suspended Burkina Faso at the exact moment the country was rebuilding its economy and reclaiming national security without foreign dependency. While Burkina Faso fought for its sovereignty, the African Union, influenced by outside powers, imposed sanctions without speaking to the people affected by them. In Traoré's words, it was a betrayal disguised as diplomacy. His message was simple but devastating. An institution that punishes independence is not an institution of Africans. The room stiffened. Delegates exchanged glances. Some were startled, others quietly intrigued. A few Western officials noted how rare it was to hear a leader challenge continental politics on an international stage. Traoré did not stop there. He spoke about legitimacy, how institutions lose moral authority when they prioritize foreign approval over African lives. He reminded the Group of 20 that Burkina Faso, despite sanctions, was stabilizing faster than several nations still dependent on external donors. This was not arrogance, it was evidence. In that moment, Ibrahim Traoré transformed Burkina Faso from an observer into a catalyst, forcing leaders to confront a truth rarely spoken in global forums. And across Africa news networks, his words spread like wildfire, resonating especially with young Africans who felt long ignored. But this confrontation did not begin in the Group of 20 hall. It began long before the summit, and the roots of this confrontation explain why Traoré chose to deliver this message on the world's biggest stage. The tension inside the Group of 20 hall deepened as President Ibrahim Traoré moved beyond criticism and began unveiling the 13 points that formed the backbone of his confrontation with the African Union. These were not abstract ideas. They were direct challenges, each one aimed at the political behaviors that, in his view, had held Africa back for generations. 1. A world divided, no room for neutrality. Traoré opened with a philosophical strike. There are oppressors, and there are the oppressed. Those who claim neutrality have already chosen their side. This was a warning not just to the African Union, but to every African leader who hides behind diplomatic silence while foreign interests shape the future of their nations. Inside the Group of 20 hall, several delegates shifted uncomfortably. The message was unmistakable. 2. The Pan-African movement is stronger than the African Union. Traoré reminded the room that unity is no longer created in conference halls. It rises from the streets, from the youth, from ordinary Africans. It is not the African Union that creates unity. It is the people. Across Africa news platforms, this quote would soon be repeated thousands of times. 3. The attempt to erase Thomas Sankara's legacy. Here, The room grew silent. Traoré revealed how archives related to Thomas Sankara were erased, hidden, or destroyed, and how African Union leaders stood by without protest. They killed the man, but they tried to kill his memory as well. For Burkina Faso, this was more than history. It was personal. 4. Western democracy has reached its limits. Before the world's richest nations, he declared, if democracy means the power of the people, then democracy was born in Africa. A direct challenge to the Western political model delivered at the Group of 20 was nothing short of extraordinary. 5. Teaching African history to African youth. Traoré emphasized that young Africans cannot be manipulated if they understand their past. He urged Group of 20 members to support educational independence instead of funding foreign-influenced institutions. 6. Responding to accusations that he talks too much. Critics from abroad claimed he was too outspoken. He responded, imperial powers talk endlessly to control minds. We talk to free them. 7. Supporting local production proof. Burkina Faso does not need the African Union. Traoré cited a local cotton processing factory restored under his leadership after years of sabotage by former governments. This was his evidence that Burkina Faso could rise again without African Union approval. If the first 7 points delivered by President Ibrahim Traoré unsettled the Group of 20 room, the remaining 6 points pierced straight into the heart of Africa's political contradictions. This was the part that exposed not only foreign interference, but the internal dynamics that keep the continent from rising. 8. The middle class captured by Western influence. Traoré argued that the most difficult group to awaken is not the poor, not the rural populations, but the African middle class. He explained that many in this group cling to privileges shaped by foreign systems and often become defenders of the very forces that limit Africa's independence. In his words, they oppose change because they fear losing comfort that was never truly theirs. His statement struck at a silent truth long avoided by African institutions. 9. The migration crisis. A modern form of mental colonization. Traoré pointed to the thousands of young Africans dying in the Mediterranean each year. Not simply because of poverty, he said, but because they were conditioned to believe that Europe, not Africa, holds the promise of a future. They are not escaping hunger. They are escaping a lie. Across Africa news outlets, this line would become one of the most quoted parts of his speech. 10. The wars of Africa, Sudan, Congo, Sahel. He listed the conflicts tearing the continent apart. Sudan, Congo, parts of the Sahel. He reminded the Group of 20 that foreign powers supply fuel, weapons, and financing not to liberate Africans, but to keep them divided. Then he delivered a blow directly at the African Union. The African Union is silent, so I must speak in their place. 11. The Institute of Black People. Traoré used the Group of 20 platform to announce the creation of a new institution designed to educate and unify Africans across the world. Its mission included intellectual liberation, Pan-African understanding, protection from media manipulation. This project, he said, will do what the African Union failed to do. 12. A call for unity beyond borders. He warned that African politics has become the #1 barrier to African unity. If the African Union refuses to unite us, then we the people will unite ourselves. 13. Closing words at the Group of 20. He ended not as a politician, but as a revolutionary. La patrie ou la mort. The hall fell silent again. Even the most skeptical delegates recognized that this was not a speech, it was a declaration. And with this declaration, Ibrahim Traoré transformed Burkina Faso from a nation under sanctions to a nation shaping history. But his words would not only echo through Africa. Their consequences, civil, political, and global, would unfold in the days to come. Inside political circles across the continent, the reaction to Ibrahim Traoré's Group of 20 speech unfolded in a tone completely different from that of ordinary citizens. Ministers, advisors, diplomats, and party officials gathered behind closed doors, watching the same broadcast the public watched, but with fears and calculations of their own. In several capitals, emergency meetings were convened within just a few hours, not to discuss global policy, but to analyze the consequences of a leader from Burkina Faso daring to challenge the African Union on the international stage. At the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, staff members moved through the hallways with a mixture of anxiety and silence. Some departments closely monitored African news reports, noting the dizzying speed at which Traoré's 13 points spread across online platforms. Other departments scanned social media to track reactions from influential youth groups, activists, and African diaspora communities. The fear did not come from Traoré criticizing the African Union. Such criticism was common. What concerned them was that he had broken an unspoken rule. One must not criticize the African Union in front of the Group of 20, an act that stripped the organization of the diplomatic insulation it had relied on for so long. In West African political blocs, particularly the Economic Community of West African States, many officials quietly expressed frustration. They worried that Traoré's speech would embolden populations already skeptical of their leadership. Some governments feared new waves of street protests. Others worried that internal factions would invoke Burkina Faso as a model of resistance. A few leaders instructed their communication teams to downplay the Group of 20 incident, hoping the moment would pass before it reshaped domestic politics. Foreign ministries across Africa debated how to respond. Some drafted cautious statements describing the speech as the passion of a young leader. Others chose complete silence, unsure whether publicly opposing Ibrahim Traoré might provoke anger among their own citizens. Diplomatic missions abroad reported a surge in questions from international media, asking whether African institutions were losing legitimacy. Meanwhile, Western embassies observed the situation with renewed interest, not because of Burkina Faso's economic weight, but because Traoré's message threatened a quiet model of influence that had functioned for decades. In parliaments from Kenya to Senegal, some lawmakers referenced the speech during live televised sessions, drawing applause from certain benches and irritation from others. Political analysts invited onto evening broadcasts debated whether African unity had reached a breaking point, or whether this confrontation might force long-delayed reforms. In academic circles and research institutes, a sense of unease spread, as scholars realized that the speech had shifted the conversation from theoretical debate to a direct challenge delivered before the world's biggest economies. And while some governments hoped the moment would fade quickly, the discussion continued to move through every political corridor. Traoré's 13 points were no longer just a speech. They were becoming a test of legitimacy. In Washington, the reaction to Ibrahim Traoré's Group of 20 speech was far more analytical than emotional. At think tanks across the city, Brookings, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the Atlantic Council researchers reviewed the transcript and immediately understood that the message delivered in that crowded hall carried implications far beyond African politics. Burkina Faso, a nation often overlooked in American foreign policy discussions, had just placed itself at the center of a conversation that touched on global power shifts, regional security, and the future of Western influence in Africa. Inside the United States Department of State, analysts from the Africa Bureau examined the 13 points line by line. They noted the clarity with which Traoré rejected the traditional frameworks that had defined relations between African states and their Western partners. For decades, United States policy toward the Sahel relied on the assumption that regional organizations like the African Union would function as reliable intermediaries. Traoré's speech challenged that architecture by suggesting that the African Union no longer represented grassroots African interests, undermining a foundational pillar of American engagement on the continent. Security officials, particularly those focused on counterterrorism, paid close attention. The United States had invested billions of dollars in Sahel stabilization efforts, yet countries such as Burkina Faso were now choosing paths independent of Western military structures. Traoré's assertion that local production, political autonomy, and cultural identity offered better security than foreign assistance forced a reassessment of long-standing assumptions in Pentagon briefings. Although Burkina Faso is not a major military power, its shift towards self-reliance raised questions about whether other Sahel nations might adopt similar positions. On Capitol Hill, staff members who followed African news noticed an increase in constituent emails asking whether the United States should reconsider its alliances. Some questioned whether supporting institutions perceived as disconnected from African citizens could undermine American credibility. Others wondered whether rising Pan-African sentiment could influence future diplomatic negotiations. American businesses with interests in African markets also took notice. Executives in the mining, energy, and telecommunications sectors quietly evaluated whether a growing wave of sovereignty rhetoric might alter investment environments, particularly in resource-rich regions like the Sahel. If Burkina Faso's stance gained traction across neighboring countries, United States corporations could face new forms of negotiation rooted in assertiveness rather than dependence. In policy circles, the biggest concern was not what Traoré had said, but how widely his message resonated. Analysts recognized that a leader from one of the world's poorest countries had managed to articulate grievances shared by millions, and that this resonance signaled political currents shifting in ways no major power could afford to ignore. In European capitals, Traoré's Group of 20 intervention sparked debates that moved far beyond the African continent. In Paris, policymakers watched his speech with particular unease, aware that Burkina Faso's government had sharply reduced French influence in the Sahel. The tone of the commentary shifted from frustration to concern, as analysts noted that the message delivered by Ibrahim Traoré could accelerate a broader rejection of European political structures across West Africa. Newspapers debated whether the African Union could survive rising public skepticism, while television hosts questioned whether Europe had misread the growing discontent building among African populations. In Berlin and Brussels, officials reacted more cautiously. They emphasized the need to understand the sentiment behind Traoré's remarks, a phrase often used in diplomatic circles when acknowledging a political shift without openly endorsing it. European Union diplomats held internal discussions about whether development strategies needed to be redesigned to reflect Africa's changing political mood. The growing attention on African news from the continent's young population was viewed as a signal that old partnership models might no longer be effective. In Beijing, analysts at government-linked institutes examined Traoré's speech through a different lens. China observed Burkina Faso's message not as a crisis, but as an opportunity to deepen ties with nations seeking alternatives to Western institutions. Traoré's emphasis on sovereignty aligned with Beijing's long-standing narrative of non-interference. Chinese media highlighted the speech as evidence that global power balances were shifting, portraying Burkina Faso as part of a broader transformation away from Western dominance. In Moscow, commentators were even more direct. Some described Traoré's remarks as a return to genuine anti-colonialism, framing Burkina Faso as a country reclaiming agency in a multipolar world. Russian broadcasters merged footage of the Group of 20 summit with historical clips of African liberation leaders, casting Traoré as the newest figure in a lineage of resistance. Across the Middle East, especially in countries managing their own complicated histories with Western influence, analysts found the speech relatable. Commentators in Turkey, Qatar, and the Gulf described the moment as evidence that smaller nations could challenge global institutions without collapsing under pressure. Discussions also focused on whether Pan-African sentiment might reshape economic partnerships or create new alliances, bypassing traditional Western oversight. On the African continent itself, reactions remained diverse. Some governments issued neutral statements, attempting to distance themselves from controversy. Others experienced internal friction as young citizens questioned whether their leaders would ever dare to speak as openly as Traoré did. And while official responses varied, the conversation continued to spread through African news networks, prompting debates that no institution, not even the African Union, could easily contain. When analysts reviewed the footage from the G20, many noticed something unusual about the atmosphere inside the hall at the moment Ibrahim Traoré spoke. For the first time in years, representatives from major global powers were not reacting to an economic crisis, a military escalation, or a natural disaster. They were reacting to the political clarity of a nation they rarely discussed. Burkina Faso, by every metric of traditional influence, should not have been able to command that level of attention. It does not have the economic weight to influence global markets. It does not possess the military capacity to shift regional balances. Yet the force of Traoré's message disrupted a pattern the G20 had become accustomed to. African leaders arriving with requests, not with indictments. There was a moment, captured by several cameras, when officials from 3 different delegations looked toward one another with the same expression: surprise mixed with a quiet calculation. They understood that something fundamentally different had just happened. A new political actor had stepped onto the stage not because of power, but because of conviction. Inside private briefing rooms after the session, advisors whispered to their ministers that they could not ignore the resonance surrounding Ibrahim Traoré. Diplomats noted that African news coverage had begun framing Burkina Faso as a symbol rather than a statistic. Journalists asked why a country under sanctions had managed to drive a global conversation more effectively than long-established African institutions. This shift did not come from economic leverage or military alliances. It came from a leader who challenged the assumptions that shaped international relations for decades. The twist was simple. A country the world expected to stay silent had spoken louder than any of the traditional regional power brokers. As the G20 discussions moved into private sessions, something unexpected began happening across diplomatic channels. Delegations that barely mentioned Burkina Faso in previous summits now circulated internal memos trying to understand the appeal of Ibrahim Traoré's message. Some questioned how a leader so young had managed to articulate frustrations shared by millions across the African continent. Others noted that Traoré did not speak like a politician negotiating for advantage, but like a man representing an entire historical burden. For many African observers, the symbolism of the moment overshadowed the venue itself. A leader from a sanctioned state had stood before the wealthiest nations on earth and confronted a continental institution that even powerful African states rarely challenge publicly. Images of Traoré in his military uniform circulated widely across African news networks, especially among young Africans who had long felt disconnected from traditional political elites. In diaspora communities from Atlanta to Paris to Johannesburg, people gathered in cafes and community halls to watch short clips of the speech. Some saw in him echoes of Thomas Sankara, a leader who believed Africa could define its own path without foreign supervision. Others described Traoré as part of a new generation, determined to break the psychological dependency that had shaped African politics for decades. Within academic circles, professors of political science discussed the implications of this moment. They questioned whether African institutions could continue operating under the same frameworks when a growing portion of the public felt more represented by Burkina Faso's rhetoric than by the African Union's official communiques. In the days following the summit, analysts noticed an unusual phenomenon. Traoré's popularity appeared to rise across countries he had never visited, among populations who had no direct political connection to Burkina Faso. People were not rallying around a government, they were rallying around an idea. The twist had taken shape. Traoré was no longer just the president of a small Sahel nation. He had become a symbol whose influence extended far beyond any national border. When the lights dimmed in the G20 hall and the delegations filed out, the conversation about the summit did not center on trade agreements or economic forecasts. It centered on a speech delivered by a leader from Burkina Faso who refused to remain within the boundaries expected of him. Across the African continent, people replayed the moment Ibrahim Traoré stood before the world's most powerful governments and spoke with a clarity that made his country impossible to ignore. The impact was not measured in headlines alone. It appeared in the faces of young Africans watching African news broadcasts with a renewed sense of possibility. It appeared in elders who remembered the voices of earlier liberation leaders and felt something familiar awaken inside them. It appeared in communities far from Ouagadougou who suddenly felt that their dignity had been defended on the world stage. Traoré's message reached beyond governments and alliances. It touched people who had long been told that small nations are meant to stay silent. It reminded them that sovereignty is not granted by outside powers, it is affirmed by those who dare to speak when silence is expected. And as discussions continue across the continent and beyond, one sentence from the G20 summit stays with millions who heard it. We did not ask for permission to be free. We stood up and claimed it. If the spirit of Ibrahim Traoré speaks to something inside you, share this story. If you believe Burkina Faso has sparked a new chapter for Africa, subscribe and stand with those who value truth over headlines. God bless Africa.